It's a real pleasure to be here. The reason that I was very keen to come and talk here today, despite the fact that we've actually got a lot of ministerial changes, as you may have read in the newspapers, was I think that this is probably the most central thing we're going to have to think about as a society. If you look over both the last several decades and the next several decades, this is the area of health that is going to change the most. And I think if you compare two different scenarios, there are many people, contrary to what you might believe if you read the media, who have a very enjoyable and fulfilling old age. They live independently, they have respect in their societies, they engage with their family, they play incredibly important roles in caring and in their wisdom and accumulated knowledge. Alongside that, there are also people who live in loneliness, in difficulty, restricted lives, and feeling in a very different place. And the difference between those two is largely, not entirely, but largely determined by the health they have at that point in time. So ensuring a healthy old age is absolutely essential now, and it will remain even more essential as we go on. So I'm going to make some, in a sense, probably fairly obvious points, and these are all slides from the annual report on healthy aging that I published on Friday last week. So, but I would encourage people who are interested in this area to read that, because it covers quite a wide sweep of different areas. I'm not going to go over all of them by any means. It's quite a sort of significant report. Let's start off with the obvious points. People are living much longer lives. There's been a bit of a levelling off in the last decade, and there was, of course, a dip during COVID, which will be temporary, but there's still some rain shadow from that. But I anticipate the upward trend will continue, although not necessarily quite at the same previous rate it was. It was initially about changes in childhood, and then subsequently about improvements in life in older age. What that means is that if you look at demographic pyramids of the UK, and for those who aren't used to these, the youngest at the bottom, oldest at the top, men on the left, women on the right, and I'll show a few of these. They're a very standard way of visualizing age. If you could look at when the NHS was founded in 1948, there was actually an extremely small elderly population. Now, older people make up a very high proportion of the work that is done by the NHS, the work that's done by social care, not, of course, by any means all. And if you project forward not very far to the middle of the century, that proportion will have gone up very significantly. So first point, this is now a big problem that wasn't there when the NHS was formed. It's going to get bigger still if we don't get it right. If we get it right, things can, as I want to go on to, improve very significantly. And this is just a different way of looking at this. I'll show three ways of looking at this. The thing I want you to concentrate on is those aged 75 and over. So there has been an increase in the population in all ages, but proportionately, the increase in those who are older has been much greater than any other age group, and that's going to continue. And if we project forward, in red are people under 16, children, young people. In light blue are people of working age. And essentially, although there will be a small increase in those populations over the rest of this century, the big increase in the population is going to be in people who are past retirement age, and a significant proportion of those over 75. So that's the situation. So in a sense, everything we're doing now becomes increasingly important as time goes by. The next general point I wanted to make is that there's an assumption by many people that as you grow older, that as the population rather grows older, that anything we do in health is just going to shove the age of mortality off to the right, and therefore people are always going to be living in long periods of ill health in the last few years of their life. That is not correct. So what you can see in this graph, what this shows is back since the 1840s, and at that point, your chances of getting to be an old person were very small. And you died at any year of your life, from the first year of your life all the way through to old age. In this era, and this will continue to be the case, provided you survive your first 48 hours, your chance of getting to your 70s are incredibly high, and your chance of getting into your 80s are also good. Your chance of getting into 100, however, remain quite small. And so what we're getting is an increasingly concentrated period of life, which is, in a sense, our natural span. Why does that matter? Well, it matters for a number of reasons. The first of them is that we are clearly, in medicine, doing very well still, but a long way still to go, at ensuring people don't die early, i.e. before they're 75. And here, these are ONS data running up to the period just before COVID, because obviously that changed things. The top line is people in their 90s. We've not increased lifespan in people in their 90s basically at all, for practical purposes, for over a decade, well over a decade now. On the other hand, people in their 70s, 40% reduction in mortality. So this concentration of mortality is becoming even greater as time goes by. What that means is, if most people are not going to die much after their 90s, if they currently, for example, get a debilitating illness at 80, they will live with it for maybe 10 years. If we can shove it to 88, they'll live with it for only 2 years. If we can shove it to 91, i.e. just past the point they've died, they're not going to live with it at all. So pushing disease off to the right, this is the first general point, in time, compresses the period of morbidity, the period people live with disabilities, that will restrict their lives. And if we push it off to the right enough, they'll happen after people are dead anyway. That's a good outcome. What most people want is to live a very good life and come to their natural end. And as a doctor, I often see this. Meet someone in their late 80s, early 90s, dying, they know they're dying, happy, saying, I've had a good innings, I'm going to use that phrase as we're here, or equivalents elsewhere, surrounded by their family. That's a good end. And then there are people where that's not the case. Our aim should be to make sure people have a very, very fulfilled old age, and that the period of disability at the end is the shortest possible. So there's a lot of things we can do to delay disability, and we should be doing them really effectively. If that extends life, that's a benefit, but the principal aim, in my view, of health research at the moment should be improving quality of old age, if the choice is between quality and quantity. And I think the great majority of the population would agree with that. Ultimately, individuals have to make their own choices, and I would very much not want that to be seen as people taking choice away from people, but I think most people want to have the ability to have a high quality of life. Moving on to the absolute period in poor health. So as the population on average has aged, the number of years in good health has gone up, but also the number of years in poor health has gone up. And in absolute terms, people are now living about a year longer with some level of disability, significant level of disability, than they would have done 20 years ago. Now, in my view, we should be aiming to compress that. That really should be a principal aim of a lot of the preventive medicine we can do and a lot of the curative medicine we can do to move that off to the right. And we know we can do this, because if you compare people living in areas of deprivation, not only do they live for a shorter period of time, well-known phenomenon, but they live for a much longer period of their life, both in absolute and relative terms, with a disability that limits their life and reduces their quality of life, reduces their independence and reduces their ability to do things. As a minimum, we can get all the people in the top bar in the areas of deprivation to a period where we shorten their period of disability to the kind of periods we've got in the lower bar, people living in areas of greater wealth. But I'm quite confident we can go further than that. So this should be an aim, and it is clearly biologically possible because we can see it happens in the areas where people live, in a sense, more fortunate lives. The third general point I wanted to make is that I think it's very easy in this area to have a negative narrative really pushed through the media and elsewhere. I'm not blaming the media, this is simply a narrative that is there. This is simply a reality. So I just think it's worth pointing out that the great majority of people who die do not have dementia before they reach their end. The great majority of people who die do not go into care homes. So most people get through to the end of their life, even quite a long life, actually with many of the disabilities people seem to think are inevitable, actually not present. That doesn't mean that these aren't very significant issues. They are, but it's just to make this point that it's not a universal phenomenon. What we should be trying to do is squeeze that proportion even further so that even fewer people have to go into care, even fewer people are living with disability. Fourth point is a geographical one. The geography of old age, this is the current situation, the geography of old age is skewed really heavily away from big urban areas. So because in the UK, a very typical approach is people come into big cities at 18 for either work, study, apprenticeships, whatever, and they leave typically after their second child or some period after that. Cities remain universally young. If you scroll forward London 20 years, it'll look very surprisingly similar to London today. Same is true in Manchester, same is true in Birmingham. But the equation has to balance. And as we're getting an older population, the rest of the country is therefore aging significantly faster than the average would imply. The second point about this is you can spot the university towns in this. And they're white. Very low proportion of the population who are younger. So the universities, the big political centres, they're all in areas where principally younger people live. Actually, where the older population live is more peripheral. And I think this skews the way the debate frequently happens because people are simply not exposed to this reality. Put it a slightly different way, here are the demographic pyramids on the top for 3 areas in the more rural and peripheral areas, great places to live, and on the bottom are urban conurbations. They're almost mirror images of one another. And very importantly, not only is there quite large numbers of older people living in these more peripheral areas, but there are not large numbers of younger people living in those areas. Who is going to provide the care? Who is going to provide the nursing? Who are going to be the doctors? All the paramedical and allied health professions, that is a significant social issue for us, and it's only going in one direction at this point in time. And if we therefore look forward, just 20 years, this is not a long period of time compared to where we are now, we can absolutely predictably, this isn't a maybe, this is a certainty, what we're going to see is a very significant increase in older people in more peripheral areas, non-urban areas, particularly coastal, particularly rural, but elsewhere as well, and much less in the urban areas. And this is just a different way of demonstrating this graphically over time. So this is largely due to internal migration, people moving away from central conurbations in the UK towards the more peripheral areas. Now, it's not inevitably to begin with that's the case everywhere in the world. If you were in Canada, for example, older people move into the cities. So it's just, this is a UK phenomenon, but we just have to accept this is the way it is, and we have to plan our services, plan our way of doing things on the basis this is what is going to happen, because that is very clearly what is happening. And this is going to be exacerbated because the ratio overall in the country of older people to working age adults, which has been essentially flat for quite a long period of time, is now moving in an adverse direction. And of course, it's the younger people, not only who provide the economic powerhouse, but it's also those who will provide the care, provide the ingenuity, do the research, provide the nursing, do the medicine. So this is something which I think is not going in practical terms in a way that's going to help us. And this ratio, unsurprisingly, is getting worse in the more peripheral areas, and quite rapidly worse as time goes by. This is a big social phenomenon we are going to have to, as a country, respond to. And if you put together the combination of deprivation and age, which are really essentially the two big drivers of ill health in adults, the biggest concentration is right at the periphery, around the coastal fringe. I did a report 2 years ago on coastal towns. This is coronary heart disease, which is essentially a combination of deprivation and age, as a marker for those forms of disease. And as you can see, a large sparing of the areas around London and the other great conurbations, and a very heavy concentration in coastal and rural areas. Fifth general point is that older adults essentially get everything that younger adults get, but more on top, and they get more of them. So as you go through age, ages, you will accumulate a wider variety of conditions, most of which are actually relatively rare when you're younger, but become common and even the majority by the time you get to older age. Some things are almost universal, like most people have to start wearing glasses at a certain point, not a particularly big deal, but very large numbers of them can be quite significantly problematic. And this brings me on to a quite fundamental point that I don't think that research has grappled with anywhere near as effectively as it needs to, and that is what is variously called multimorbidity, multiple disease, or multiple long-term conditions, or multiple conditions in the same person. There's a variety of ways of calling it. But as time goes by through our lives, we accumulate diseases. And that means, and increasingly, what we're getting, because of the effectiveness of medicine and nursing and public health in preventing disease in younger life, people can often go from a position where they have no diseases to several diseases in really quite short order. Now, why does that matter? Why am I stressing that? Really 3 points. The first of which is that this biologically aging process happens much more quickly on average, in areas of deprivation. And you can see in this graph that, on average, people living in deprivation may be up to 10 years, in a sense, older from the point of view of multimorbidity than people living in the areas of greatest affluence. Second reason that's important is the health service is essentially designed around single disease or single organ management. You go to an eye clinic and a cardiology clinic and an infectious clinic. You can have an 80-year-old person shunted around 7 or 8 clinics on 10 different nice pathways, and training in medicine is largely mono-disease or mono-organ specific. We have to get back to a situation where, in addition to people specializing, a very good thing, people maintain strong generalist skills. That is the only way we're going to deal with the fact that multimorbidity is already a big problem and will become more of a problem. And we need to be able to respond to that. And then scientifically, there is very little research. There's extraordinarily good research that takes us vertically from bench to bedside, whether it's up in engineering or biomedical or many other spheres. There's much less that actually talks about the way the different diseases interact in individual people, both at a biological level, why are they clustered together, and at a functional level. So, for example, someone who's lost a bit of balance, got mild cataracts, and got osteoporosis, any one of those is a risk. All 3 of them mean the risk of someone getting a subsequent hip fracture and all that follows are considerably greater. So these interactions, I think, we are only in the foothills of taking seriously. MRC, NIHR, UKRI more widely have started to look at this very seriously, but I think there is a very long way to go. And I think if we want to be serious about caring for older people, we need to take account of that. And then there are some conditions where we simply do not have good medical countermeasures at all. I'm going to use dementia as a proxy for this. There's some debate about whether the incidence of dementia, the number of new cases, is going down or is stable or indeed is going up. I think my view is going down a bit, particularly in men, largely for vascular reasons. But because people are living longer, the number of people living with dementia undoubtedly is going up, and we don't have good treatments for this. We have some very early ones, but they are in no sense transformational. So, but I could choose a number of other degenerative diseases, and the same would apply. So we're not going to be able to magic all of this away in the foreseeable future with existing science. This is made more tricky because there are some diseases of older age where we have extremely good data, and we have some diseases of old age where we simply do not. So it is relatively straightforward, for example, to find the prevalence of people living, in this case I've chosen with prostate cancer in men and breast cancer in women. Finding the same kind of data, for example, finding people living with incontinence, is considerably more difficult. And one of the old cliches of government is that what gets measured gets done. So if we do not have the data, don't expect any changes to happen. Getting data on the much wider range of conditions that people have, not just the big diseases people die of, but the ones that cause disability and lack of dignity and limitations on life. We've really got to get these data and get them in a granular way, because that will allow at least people to see the problem and, as a result, hopefully invest in finding and then rolling out the solutions. Finally, a few comments on research, as this is a research meeting, although I think there are research implications from several of the points I've made. The first is there are many areas of older age which are substantially under-researched compared to where they should be. So I've chosen here, I happen to be an infectious disease, both doctor and academic, and I would say that there's absolutely a stunningly good research on infections in children and infections in younger adults. Proportionately, there is a much smaller amount of research on infections in older adults, and yet if you look at who really suffers from ill health and subsequently mortality from infectious diseases, it is in fact older people. And this is repeated across many other areas of medicine. I would say the same, for example, in mental health. I would say the same in quite a number of other degenerative diseases. The ratio of research effort to younger adults to older adults is disproportionate to the proportion of the people who've actually got disease states. And therefore, I think there are large numbers of areas where we should really be pushing the average age people are studying up the age spectrum, because that is, in fact, where the disability and in due course mortality risks are. I also think that we need to go back to a fairly old-fashioned approach to thinking about public health: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and treatment. I've always thought tertiary prevention is a largely meaningless construct. We can do two things, and I want to go through where I think the research on both of these are significantly to improve the lives of ourselves when we grow older, of current older adults, of older adults in the future. The first is to shift disease off to the right, so people have a much shorter period in ill health, have less multimorbidity, have a better quality of life. And the second, which I'll come on to, is to change the environment so that someone with the same level of disability can actually have a much more dignified, independent and enjoyable life than they would have done without those changes. And some of the excellent things in the video just before I started, I think, show some of the ways all of you have been engaging in this. So let's start on the first of these. We should be looking very seriously at all the things we can do on primary prevention, which, for the sake of argument, in my view, is the things that government does, national and local. That's changing the laws, that's pushing down on things like smoking, air pollution, big driver of strokes, for example, salt, a variety of those kind of things. That's government's job. Then there's a large amount of things we can do on secondary prevention. I've chosen ones for cardiovascular disease. I could have chosen other ones. Secondary prevention is where we find someone who's got a risk factor or who's got a disease, and we slow the disease right down by intervening. Antihypertensive, statins, antiplatelet agents are examples in cardiovascular. The same is true in many other areas. So that's individualized medical intervention by doctors, nurses, allied health professionals. And then finally, there's treatment, which I'm not going to go into in great detail. But treatment, I think, is the one which tends to get the lion's share of people's interest. If you think about these massive improvements in reductions, let's say in stroke, a big cause of disability in older people, I would say the exact numbers are difficult to tell, but probably about a third is primary prevention, about a third is secondary, and about a third is treatment. And yet we weight a lot of our research effort towards the treatment end, despite the fact that actually getting ahead of it, stopping it, slowing it down, can actually have much bigger impacts on people's longer-term quality of life. And then alongside that is adapting the environment to allow older people with a fixed level of disability to have a good and independent life. And a lot of this is in the sphere of engineering. Built environment, housing that is appropriate for older people. Some of the aids that were being talked about in the video beforehand are examples of this, and then translating that into planning and into urban design. These are things which mean that the quality of life for someone with the same amount of disability can be significantly greater or not, depending on whether we do it properly. And we should assume that these things are often more difficult than they look. For example, if you go into a rural area, you think it must be easy for someone to exercise and walk around until you realise that there's no pavement between them and the nearby walking trails, and they're not going to be able to walk along a busy road. So very often these things are much more difficult than they look, but can easily be fixed. Simple things may be all that we need: ramps, grab rails, places for people to sit, toiletry facilities, but others as well. Finally, some very specific points on research. It is still the case, and has historically been even more the case, that research studies exclude older people or people with multimorbidity. This is absurd. It is also, in my view, unscientific. So people are essentially choosing a group of people who are totally atypical for the group of diseases that they are considering. We should push back very heavily against age and comorbid or multimorbid exclusions from any study. Observational, engineering, clinical trial, doesn't matter. As I said earlier, some areas such as social care and frailty and old age, aging and ethnic minority populations, mental health, for example, are significantly under-researched compared to where we absolutely need to be. And there are very many other research gaps, and I pointed out the example of infections. So my final slide really is hopefully the entry to a discussion with all of you. We absolutely must remove all barriers to people being enrolled in studies and trials. We significantly need to expand the proportion of research in health that is going to older people, because that is where the growth in the population is going to be. Within that, social care needs to be a very large component, because it's not just health needs, it's also care needs that we need to get right. We must think about the under-researched causes of disability rather than only concentrating on those diseases that kill people. Back to my very strong mantra that this should be about quality of life, not quantity of life. There has to be a lot of urban design and engineering research, so this is not the job of doctors, this is the job of people with very different sets of skills. And of course we must encourage innovation of equipment and adaptation to support older people. So these seem to me some of the major priorities we need to address. My final point is that when there's not enough research being done, we need to work out why. Is this because there isn't enough money in the area? That is actually the easiest to fix. Large amounts of science, large amounts of researchers, large amounts of questions, no money. Is the problem that the science is just not there? Or is the problem we do not have enough skilled people to answer these questions? And I think when we deal with many of these problems, it's a mixture of all three. And if it's the last of those, we have to build that capacity up, because in the future, we're going to need a much higher proportion of people concentrating on older age than we do at the moment. And we already need, in my view, more than we have. Thank you very much.
Chris, so we do have some time for questions. I've noticed that nothing's coming on Slido, so please do get active and start posing the questions that you want to hear. But I had a couple anyway that I sort of wanted to pose. And the first one is, over the last 5 years, I think sometimes we've felt trapped in between two big things in healthcare. I'll characterise it as the crisis at the front door of the NHS and what Sir Michael Marmot would be saying about everything's about the early years. So really interested in why you think now is the right time to publish your annual report on health in an ageing society, and how that might either complement or conflict with those other agendas.
Well, firstly, on health, the right time to publish my report would probably have been about 25 years ago, but I was still a junior doctor then, so that wouldn't have probably had much cut through. The way to deal with health at the front door in the future is to deal with all the preventative issues now. That is absolutely essential. And if you want people to leave home leave for home from hospitals and other healthcare, you need to provide an environment where, with whatever level of disability they have, they can operate as effectively as possible. So in a sense, both of the things I've talked about are the way that you deal with the front door problem 10, 20, 30 years down the line. Research is always forward-looking. So, are we going to fix the problem next year by this kind of research? Generally, no. Sometimes we may chip away at it. Will we reduce the impact on the health service in 20 years' time? Absolutely, yes. This is the essential thing for us to do. So I think there's no conflict there. And on what Michael Marmot says, and I'm a great fan of Michael, I think people who don't really think through what he's saying can interpret it quite nihilistically, actually, which is if you can't change all of society, you can't do anything. That is not what he's saying, but that's what people can sometimes think. Actually, we can do a huge amount here. And if you look historically, if you look over the last 20 or 30 years, we have improved many areas of healthcare very substantially. Strokes have gone down maybe 70-ish% over the last few decades. That's an astonishing improvement. There are many other ones I could choose. Many of the inflammatory diseases, fractions of their previous self, much of the treatment for things like cancers, which left a lot of disability, are much better than they were, etc. So we can improve things, and we can improve things in terms of our environment. My view is that the problem is the rate of change is too slow, given the fact that we've got already a big deficit, and it's only going to go in one direction in terms of our research against our need. So I think my view is actually what I'm talking about is completely compatible with what they're saying and shouldn't be seen in any way in tension. It's really a matter of what timescales you look over.
I'm sure that's music to a lot of people's ears in this room, because it's been a difficult conversation. I'm going to go, actually, careful what I wish for in terms of asking for questions from the audience, because we've had a flood. But based on the rule that if it's not measured, it's not done, do you think that there should be NHS targets for the amount of resource and funding going into prevention versus treatment?
I'm always extremely cautious of calling for targets. It's a very easy thing to do, and it's only when you've got one you realise that it tends to lead to perverse incentives. So including things like people relabelling things that were not actually about older people as if they were, and so on. So actually I think targets can be quite double-edged. I think what we actually need to do is make the case, and make the case repeatedly and clearly, because I think that the case is an unanswerable one, personally. I've never heard anybody push back against the kind of points I've been making, which I'm sure many of you have been making, and we just need to keep on making it and making it in public.
And I'm going to stay a little bit on the subdata subject. I mean, I think we're acutely aware that typically women arrive in later life with fewer resources, with more accumulated disadvantage than men. Is there a data gap between what we know about the health of men and the health of women in this case?
I don't think that it's one of the biggest data gaps. I think there are bigger ones, including geographical ones and including, for example, ethnicity. But the fact, we can describe the problems of older women extremely well. What we're not doing is doing something about it. So I don't consider this as an area where it's lack of knowledge. I think it's actually lack of forward progress that's our issue here. So I think we should be careful we don't, in a sense, misascribe the problem.
Fine. And I know there's a lot of questions that have come in about funding, and I should just sort of say that, so Chris isn't responsible for budgets in this case.
I have many burdens, but that's not one of them, no.
Yes. But we will store those up and pose them when we can to Professor Lucy Chappell, who does have a bigger responsibility in that respect. There are some questions about innovation. I'd just be curious. So your final slide talks a lot about research needs. And it's sort of noticeable that innovation wasn't there. But is that implied in what you're saying? And how do you see that working?
I think one of the problems with this is that everybody, when you say innovation, my experience is if 10 people say it, they mean 10 different things by it. I'm using research in an incredibly loose sense to mean any new knowledge of any sort, which would include innovation in all its broad forms, and indeed include development. It's the things which get you from where we are now to a solution all the way along the pathway, which takes different forms. So it's purely a linguistic point, really.
No, fine. There's some really interesting questions internationally, and be curious about how much you think your report and your work has been influenced by what's going on elsewhere in the world.
I decided not to put too much on international experience because it was already running to almost 400 pages, and my view was that there's a certain point you kind of have to stop. But actually there is a huge amount for us to learn from other nations and other societies and the way they do things. Obviously there are some countries, Japan, South Korea most obviously, which are further ahead than us in terms of their demographic structure. There are others, let's say the Scandinavian countries, Canada, which are approaching the same problems with a relatively similar demography, but in a different way. So I think it is very important we do look more widely. And in general, the more dissimilar a society is, the more you tend to learn from it, because they tend to approach things intellectually in a different way as well as practically in a different way. So I think there's a lot to do to look internationally, but also, of course, there's a lot to do domestically.
And then I'm ask another one. There's a whole load of stuff around innovation. I think there's a mantra sometimes published around about health equals wealth. But I think we see that actually that sometimes has two legs. There's a life science industrial strategy and there's a health of a nation. They're not necessarily the same thing. Do you think we've got the balance right in terms of the amount of investment in research that will lead to new treatments versus research into things that won't lead to a pill or a life science, but might tell you a better form of exercise or a better way to design our communities? Do you think that balance is?
I mean, in general, a much higher proportion of the kind of research in the first group actually comes from the private sector, done in the private sector. So it is important that the public sector also contributes to that. They also are very important for setting the framework, having things like MHRA running in a good way, having in the NHR structures around the country. So we can underpin a lot of the life sciences, but if you look at the actual investment into that end of it, there's much more private money than there is public. On the other hand, on the other areas, you can't expect the private sector to invest in something from which there is, by definition, no return on investment, and therefore all of that is going to have to be picked up by the public sector if it is to have to be done, or by the charity sector, which in the UK we're very fortunate to have a very large and extremely effective research charity sector. And so I think, I don't think there's a right answer to what the balance is, but I think the UK is actually pretty strong in both areas of that by global standards. My general view is we need to increase the amount going into older people in both those categories rather than to worry too much about the balance between them. And I was very struck when I was Government Chief Scientific Advisor for a short period of time that I asked the question, why is there not equivalent of mother care or baby, the various baby and children's shops on the high street, given the huge population who have their own money to do things? Why are not, they're not walking aids which are carbon fibre in multicolours and all sorts of designs? And what I was told was this is not a fashionable area to go into, essentially. That's a précis, but not much of a précis. And I think we should be encouraging the private sector to see this is a huge opportunity for them to do things and us to actually get a wider range of products. Because it seems to me that this is a daft position given, if you look at that demographic pyramid I showed you, in a sense my view is the way we frame it is almost as if we're still in the 1950s. And actually we're not, and that is not the structure going forward. So we should be encouraging positively, not negatively, not finger wagging, actually positively encourage the private sector into this sphere, because it seems to me an incredibly useful area for all of us.
There's a lot of questions around with a nutrition flavour. I noticed on your slide on primary prevention, you had smoking, you had salt, but you didn't talk more generally about obesity and those sorts of things. Where do you see that fitting in this agenda?
Yeah, nutrition is an incredibly wide area, ranging from, vitamin D through a whole bunch of other things. But on obesity specifically, there are many things that are going right. Obesity is firmly going wrong, particularly in areas of deprivation. And that is the biggest headwind from a biomedical point of view across a whole range of things. It makes almost every area of medicine more difficult, and it makes a very large number of the diseases of disability more likely, and it means that people who've got other problems have a much harder time of it. If you're living with obesity and you've also got balance problems, you've also got whatever, you're going to find it much tougher. So I think this is an issue of very significant seriousness, and I could have done another 100 slides. I decided to stop it on that one, but I completely agree with the basic drive of that, which obesity is one of the biggest negative things we need to do to ensure people enter and maintain their old age in good health.
Good. And a really interesting question coming in from online again, which I think really speaks to a lot of the work that we've been doing of working on innovation closer to market. And the question is really, what in your view is the role of implementation science to enable us to address some of these blockers to the scale and spread of innovation?
I think it's a very large part of this, actually. Implementation science language can sometimes be a bit forbidding for those who are not actually in the field, and I think we maybe need to kind of slightly reframe some of the ways we do it. What we're really doing, very straightforwardly, is saying we've actually got some things we know work, and we've got some people who it would really benefit, and those two are not getting together. What can we do to achieve the greatest possible support with existing things for those who are either now living with problems or will predictably be living with problems in the future? And I think we should be doing a lot more of that kind of research. Now, where that's about a product, back to a previous conversation we've just had, if this is about a product from a company, they may well do it as part of essentially, then might be called marketing, but it is still actually much of it the same kinds of thinking. If it's about behaviours which don't have a return on investment, then it's clearly going to have to be from within the public sector, and implementation science in its multiple forms, I think is sensible. If I could make one comment on implementation science, I years ago did a not very good MBA. I learned only one thing from it, and that was that marketing is a genuine skill and a genuine science, and we don't use enough of it in the public sector. We actually need to be much better at being systematic and learning from the private sector about how you do, in a sense, create a market, shape a market, and respond to a market. And I think we are often a bit queasy about that, and we shouldn't be. We should actually be fairly straightforward about it.
Good. So your talk talked a lot about that compression of mobility, in the jargon of our conference, adding life to years. That was the goal when we set off. It's still a goal hidden away a little bit in the levelling up strategy. Do you think that should be a headline goal for any government of any flavour going forward? So it doesn't have to be a political question, but it's more about the nation.
Well, I think that if you're a stateswoman or a statesman looking at those graphs and you're not thinking, I need to do something about this, then there's a very serious question why, in my view. And that's true in local government as well as in national government. An aside point, but I think something which people forget, most local political leaders will live, their children will live, their grandchildren will live in the same place as they are. They have a very strong interest in making sure that community enters the next 10, 20 years, possibly a more direct one than secretaries of state who will inevitably have to move around between different departments as part of their careers. So I think we should be thinking, engaging with the political system and actually making the point how important this is, but also, and I think this is really critical, I think we can sometimes make the point that this is a problem and then sit there and wait for them to provide a solution. Actually, far more useful is to go forward and say, here's a big problem. The issues are, they're indisputable, but actually there's a bunch of things you can do across a whole range of different areas, and we can address this problem. So I think what we have to do is present, along with the problem, present a range of solutions, both in the prevention of disease, delay of disease, and also in the how do you create an environment where people with some level of disability, you will get as you age, because we all will, can operate in an independent, dignified, and enjoyable way.
Good. Another great question come in here, which is, so given the need that you've expressed to focus on multimorbidity, And that's been acknowledged probably for over a decade, and I know it's a big part of UKRI's sort of current strategy. What are the instrumental changes needed to actually make that happen?
Well, I think that you say it's been acknowledged for over a decade. Actually, it wasn't really being talked about much 10 years ago, frankly. It was acknowledged, but in quite small groups. And the first call that UKRI, well, the MRC and NIHR did on this got a very, very thin response. Very few people thought they had much to do with it. Now there are very many more people who are there. I think what you have to do is broadly three things. You have to make clear that the problem is a huge problem across the whole board. You have to make clear that there is money in this area and there will be for the indefinite future, because otherwise people won't shift careers. You don't shift careers for a single grant. You shift careers because you see this is the trend of the future. And then you have to make clear that this is intellectually very exciting. So, for example, I've tried to make the case, because it is true, that these diseases cluster together in particular ways, some of them by more than you'd expect by chance alone. That must tell us a basic biological phenomenon that we currently do not understand. We can see the really big ones, the cluster around smoking, the cluster around diabetes, the cluster around obesity, but there are very many other clusters that we haven't identified why they're there, because I think most people want to go into it because they want to feel that they're doing something useful, that they have a future in it, and it's got an intellectual stimulation, that this will still be interesting to them in 10 years and 20 years. My view is all of those are met with multimorbidity, and we need to make that case really clearly.
Good. I'm going to ask one final question. It's actually very pertinent to the structure of what we've been doing, and that's, could you say something about how you see the arts and humanities adding to the agenda that you're supporting, and what is the role for them in helping keep older people better and happier?
Well, I think that leaving aside questions about where you put the barrier between the arts, humanities and the sciences, which I've always thought is a bit greyer than it's sometimes made out to be, let's take something which I think most people would accept is fully arts, history. Very large numbers of things we could learn from of things that were done 30, 40, 50 years ago, which have simply been forgotten. If it's not on Google Scholar, if it's not on PubMed, it doesn't exist. Actually, a lot of very interesting thinking was done in some of these areas back in the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, and indeed historically. Some of the ways about which we think about old age go back a long way. There are, I think, very important philosophical questions about what do we as society want and how do we balance old age against other stages of life and so on. I could go through all, many different areas of the arts and say those are fundamental. You can't answer this just with biomedicine, just with engineering, just with the hard sciences. There's a very large sweep, clearly in the social sciences, anthropology, behavioural science, economics, but then right over to things which are firmly in the arts, and I think we should see it as full spectrum. As a lapsed research funder, arts funding also has a huge advantage, which is it is very cheap. So you can get an awful lot of history for the price of a single clinical trial. So therefore, it is an area where I think we should be seeking to expand rather than, in my view, to contract.
Good. We could have gone on for ages, but I know our time is up. We've been truly honoured to have you here. We're delighted that you published your annual report. So I'd ask you please to join me in thanking Professor Whitty.